Her cry broke into the night like a rifle shot, sharp and hollow, tearing through the stillness of the prairie. "No one will accept me with my children," she whispered. Her voice cracked as though the words themselves were splinters in her throat. Two little girls clung to her skirt, one barely 4, the other 5, their small fingers grasping fabric worn thin by hunger and wandering. They didn't understand the weight their mother carried, but they felt it pressing down through her trembling body, and in the emptiness of that hour, with no roof but the stars, she believed her own words were true, because so far they had been. The road behind her was littered with the echoes of rejection. Men who looked at her and saw a future, and then looked at her daughters and saw an anchor. The last one had been the worst, a rancher named Silas, with shoulders as broad as a barn door and a heart narrower than a canyon. He had spoken softly at first, of giving her a home, a place to rest her weary bones. He'd looked at her with a hungry fire in his eyes, a fire she thought might warm her. But then his eyes fell upon the children, and the fire turned to ice. His tone hardened. He'd muttered excuses about the cost of feed, about the long hours of work, about needing his freedom. But the truth lay naked in his silence, cold and sharp. He saw not a woman of impossible strength, but a burden multiplied by 2. She had watched him mount his horse, watched his figure blur into the dusty horizon, and with every hoofbeat, she felt the earth itself confess her abandonment. It was a rhythm she knew by heart. Her daughters, Anya and Lena, asked no questions. They never did. Lena, the younger, pressed a small hand into hers, sticky with the crumbs of their last piece of bread. Anya, the older, wrapped her thin arms around her mother's waist as if to guard her against the cruelty of grown men. Their innocence cut deeper than any insult. In their eyes she was still whole, still capable, even though she felt like a hollowed-out tree standing against a wind that never stopped blowing. She carried stories in her blood, passed down from her grandmother, of fireside chants and rivers that once sang her people's names. But the world she walked through now did not remember those stories. It looked at her buckskin dress, at her dark braids tied with fading beads, and it saw only otherness. A problem to be solved. A mouth to be fed. A thing to be cast aside. In the silence of her nights, when the girls were curled beside her, she told them tales. Tales of rivers turning into silver snakes, of mountains that spoke in thunder, of mothers who were warriors and who never, ever left their young. Her words carried them into sleep, into a world where they were safe. But she herself lay awake, staring at a sky that was too wide, too empty, wondering if tomorrow held a place where she might finally rest, or if it was just another stop on a road that led to nowhere. The hope was getting thin, thinner than the soles of her moccasins, thinner than the soup she made from scavenged roots. She was beginning to think that cry in the night wasn't a fear. It was a prophecy. At dawn, they entered a town. A collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings that seemed to squint at them under the rising sun. Her girls walked beside her, their bare feet dusted red from the long road. Eyes peered through lace curtains, watching their every move. She felt the judgment like a physical weight pressing on her shoulders. She stepped into a general store, the bell above the door announcing her unwanted presence. She offered the shopkeeper a bracelet of beads, her grandmother's intricate pattern woven with skill and patience, in exchange for a bag of flour. The shopkeeper, a man with a face like sour milk, just shook his head. His lips were a thin, disapproving line. He muttered something about too many mouths to feed, his eyes flicking to the girls as if they were vermin. She didn't argue. She had no fight left for men like him. She simply gathered her daughters, their small hands finding hers, and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight. Her heart ached with a familiar dull pain, yet she kept her head lifted high. Her children watched her every movement, and she would not let despair carve itself upon her face for them to see. Not yet. It was then, in that moment of quiet defiance, that she noticed him. A man leaning against the post, outside the store, half hidden in the shadows of the awning. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that studied her not with pity, not with scorn, but with a strange, unnerving stillness. His clothes bore the dust of 1,000 trails, his boots scarred by long, hard miles. His presence was quiet, almost invisible, yet she felt his gaze reach her in a way the whole town's hostile stares never had. It wasn't a look of judgment, it was a look of recognition. She looked away quickly, pulling her girls closer, unwilling to let that fragile thing called hope breathe too soon. It had only ever brought her pain. Still, the shape of him lingered in her mind, like a chord struck faintly and left vibrating in the air. That evening she found herself at the edge of town, far enough away that the whispers and the stares could not reach her. She built a small fire from fallen twigs, its glow a fragile, defiant island in the vast, encroaching dark. Her daughters curled against her sides, their soft, even breathing a lullaby to her weary bones. For the first time in many days, with the children asleep, she allowed the tears to come. They slipped from her eyes, hidden beneath her palms, as she stared into the flames. "No one will accept me with my children," she confessed again. Not to the girls, but to the night, her words trembling into the rising smoke. The fire wavered and hissed as though it mourned with her. And then came the sound of footsteps, deliberate but unhurried, pressing gently into the silence of the prairie. She stiffened instantly, her body going rigid, one arm circling both girls, pulling them tight against her. A predator? A thief? Her mind raced through all the terrible possibilities. Into the small circle of firelight stepped the cowboy from the town. The stranger. He didn't speak. He simply crouched at the edge of the fire, laying a canteen of water and a whole loaf of bread near her side. The flames painted his face with shifting patterns of amber and shadow, revealing eyes as steady and deep as riverstone. He neither pitied her nor turned away. He just watched. His hand brushed hers as he set down the bread, not in demand, not in threat, but in a quiet offering, like a bridge being laid across a deep, dark chasm. She met his gaze, and in their depths, she felt the unbearable stillness of possibility pressing close. Her heart stuttered in her chest, a frantic bird torn between the instinct of fear and a desperate hunger for trust. The children shifted in their sleep, blissfully unaware that the night had bent itself around this new, unexpected shape. And in that moment, with her confession still trembling in the air between them, she realized that the path she thought was lonely, the path she thought ended only in darkness, might not end in silence after all. The fire popped, throwing a shower of sparks up toward the endless stars. He didn't move, only stayed. His presence said more than words could ever bear. And as she watched him, breath caught in her throat, she felt something stir inside her, an answer to the cry her soul had long sought, yet had always feared to claim. The night held its breath, waiting for her to decide, waiting for her to choose whether to turn away from this strange kindness or to let the stranger remain. What she didn't know was that he had no intention of leaving. Not now. Not ever. The sun rose soft and gold, laying a quiet light upon their makeshift camp. She sat with her daughters still pressed against her sides, their small bodies warm and real. She hadn't slept. Not a wink. The stranger had remained through the long, dark night, a silent shadow at the edge of the fire's dying glow. His hat was tipped low over his face, his breathing even and slow. He had kept watch. When Lena, the younger girl, stirred and blinked her sleepy eyes into the new morning, she saw him first. She didn't cry out. She didn't seem scared at all. Her small hands, dirt-lined but gentle, offered him a crooked wildflower she had plucked from the roadside before dusk. He received it with a solemn, surprising care, tucking the small purple bloom into the leather band of his hat as though it were the most precious thing he had ever carried. The child giggled, a sound as clear as a bell, and leaned back against her mother. And the woman, Alara, felt the stir of something too fragile, too dangerous to name. Through the day, he lingered. He never imposed, never pushed, his presence as steady and constant as the sun climbing the sky. He fetched water from a nearby creek without asking. He traded his own supply of dried jerky for the intricate beadwork she offered, treating the transaction with a seriousness that honored her skill. He even whittled thin reeds into tiny, shrill whistles for the children to master, their piercing notes cutting through the heavy silence of her guarded heart. Their laughter followed, bright and unrestrained, and she realized it had been so long, so very long, since joy had been allowed to bloom without the shadow of fear cutting it down. She watched him carefully, a hawk watching a fox near her nest. She expected at any moment the shift, the flicker of impatience, the turning away she had known in every single man before him. But he remained unhurried, his focus absolute, as though the simple rhythm of her daughter's play was reason enough to stay, as though it was all that mattered in the world. The town, however, was not silent. Whispers followed them like biting flies whenever they appeared. When she walked with her daughters toward the well, he walked a few paces behind, a silent guardian. When he carried a sack of flour back from the store at her side, a purchase he had made with his own coin, she felt the eyes upon them, sharp as burrs in the skin. Men called him a fool under their breath. Women looked upon her as though she had cast some dark spell, as though she had stolen what was not hers to hold. He never answered their words. He never even seemed to hear them. His silence was not the silence of shame or rejection, but of defiance. It was a quiet, unyielding refusal to let their small, bitter world decide what mattered. And slowly, so slowly, she began to see his stillness not as emptiness, but as a kind of shield. A shield he held up not just for himself, but for her, for them. But you can't outrun the past forever. Sooner or later, it always catches up. It wasn't long before it returned, riding a cloud of dust and arrogance. The rancher, Silas, the one who had spoken of shelter before casting them out, appeared again at the edge of the main street. His eyes held a cruel, possessive glimmer when they met hers, and when they flicked to the cowboy standing nearby, they narrowed with contempt. His voice, when he spoke, was a whip crack of mockery. He laughed, a loud, ugly sound designed to draw attention, and it did. A small crowd of loafers and gossips began to gather. He spat words into the dust, words about scraps no one else wanted, about burdens dressed in buckskin with half-breed children dragging behind like anchors. Her body froze. The world seemed to tilt and shrink until it was just that dusty street, those jeering faces, and Silas's hateful words. She clutched both daughters to her, their small bodies trembling against hers. Shame, hot and suffocating, rose like a fire in her chest. She had lived this moment too many times before. The judgment, the humiliation, the sting of being seen not as a woman, but as a weight no man would ever dare to carry. Her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line as her eyes dropped to the dust, ready to turn, ready to gather her girls and walk away once more. It was all she knew how to do, but the cowboy moved before she could. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and Silas, his figure solid and unmovable against the storm of taunts. His voice was low, but it was ironed with a cold, hard steel that cut through the rancher's laughter. "You're blind," the cowboy said, his words dropping like stones into the sudden silence. "What you call burdens are blessings, and no man who turns away from such strength could ever call himself whole." The crowd quieted, a ripple of unease crawling across their faces. The rancher shifted, his bravado cracking, anger breaking through his smug grin. But even he, for all his bluster, could find no words to answer. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, Ilara heard a man speak not for himself, but for her honor, and her breath caught in her throat at the sound. But as he stood there, shielding her from the world, a new and terrible thought took root in her mind. This quiet man, this Jed, was a protector. He was strong, but Silas was cruel and vindictive. By defending her, Jed hadn't just made an enemy. He had painted a target on all their backs. They left the town before twilight, the children clambering along the path that led toward the river, eager to splash in the shallow, sun-warmed pools. Their small voices were filled with an innocent joy that felt a world away from the ugly scene on the street. Ilara followed slowly, her steps heavy with the weight of all the things she could not yet say, all the fears she could not yet voice. He walked beside her, silent as always, his presence a comforting, terrifying constant. They reached the water's edge as the sun began its slow descent. The girls laughed, tossing pebbles into the current, chasing minnows in the shallows, their voices ringing across the water like tiny bells. She watched them, a fierce love swelling in her chest. Then she turned her gaze downward, staring at her own reflection in the slow-moving water, and the old, familiar ache rose within her, like a wound reopened by Silas's cruel words. "No one will accept me with my children," she whispered again. This time, her voice trembled less with despair and more with a weary resignation, as though she were carving the truth into stone for him to see. It was a test, a final warning. She kept her eyes fixed on the river, unwilling to meet his, unwilling to see the inevitable pity or, worse, the agreement that she knew must be there. The words had always been a final wall, the sentence that ended every fragile promise. She expected silence. She expected him to nod slowly, to finally understand the impossibility of it all. She expected him to turn and walk away as all the others had. But he didn't. Instead, she felt his hand cover hers, his palm warm and steady, pressing her trembling fingers into stillness. When she finally dared to look up, she found his gaze unbroken, steady, and sure. "You're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He told her she was wrong. He told her that she and her daughters were his heart's choice, not as burdens he was willing to carry, but as the very breath his own soul had long been missing. His voice carried no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, only the quiet, unshakable weight of a vow. And then he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He turned to the girls, kneeling down to their small height, letting them press their wet, laughing faces into his shoulders. Their arms wrapped around his neck, as though they had always known he would be theirs, as though he had always been a part of their world. The sound of the river stilled in her ears. The world, so often a place of cruelty and hardness, seemed for a moment to lean toward grace. Tears filled her eyes, not from weakness or sorrow, but from the unbearable relief of being truly, completely seen. She had walked through endless nights believing her path was a lonely one, believing her children were anchors pulling her down into a sea of rejection. But here was a man who had chosen her, not despite them, but because of them. The setting sun sank low, painting the water with streaks of liquid fire. She felt her heart race, torn between a lifetime of disbelief and the rising, powerful tide of hope. The girls clung to him, their happy voices carrying like music across the silent plains. She could not yet speak the words of acceptance, but something deep in her chest shifted, a heavy door creaking open where before only solid stone had stood. As the light deepened into shades of purple and orange, he drew her hand to his chest, placing it flat against the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. His eyes never left hers. "Forever," he said, the words soft but unshaken. Forever with you, and with them. The words sank into her like gentle rain into dry, cracked earth. She felt herself yield, trembling, as the fear that had defined her for so long began to crack and fall away. The sky darkened, the river whispered its ancient secrets, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if the crushing loneliness she had carried for so long was at last reaching its end. As her children's laughter wrapped them all in a circle of pure, uncomplicated sound, she understood that the night ahead would not belong to despair. It would belong to a promise powerful enough to silence every rejection she had ever known. But as she finally let herself believe, she saw him glance back toward the trail leading to town. His eyes weren't filled with love. They were filled with calculation, and a flicker of something she had seen once before. Fear. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The promise of forever hung in the air, sweet and fragile. But the look in Jed's eyes had poisoned it. The peace she had felt for a fleeting moment was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He had looked back at the trail not like a man leaving a bad memory behind, but like a soldier watching for an advancing army. That night, as the girls slept soundly for the first time in weeks, their bellies full and their minds at peace, Ilara lay awake, watching him. He sat by the fire, cleaning his pistol with a slow, methodical calm that was more unnerving than any outburst of anger could be. The gentle man who had whittled whistles for her daughters was gone. In his place was a man who knew violence, a man who was preparing for it. "Who are you?" she finally whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. He stopped his work, his hands going still on the polished steel of the gun. He didn't look at her for a long moment, his face a mask of shadows. "I'm a man who made a promise," he said, his voice low and rough, a long time ago, to a friend. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. The evasion was worse than a lie. It was a wall, and she was on the wrong side of it. She pushed herself up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You knew who I was. In the town. You were looking for me." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. He finally turned his head, and in the flickering firelight she saw the deep sorrow etched on his face. "Yes," he admitted. "I was." Before she could demand an answer, he reached into the pocket of his worn leather vest and pulled something out. It was a small, creased photograph, the edges soft with time. He held it out to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. It was a picture of two men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting into the sun. They were young, full of a reckless life that had long since been burned out of them. One of the men was a younger version of Jed. The other was her husband, Kyle. The man she told her daughters had died a hero's death fighting for his people. The man who had left her with two babies and a world of pain. The story she had clung to, the noble lie she had told her children to give them a father worth remembering, crumbled to dust in her hands. "You were friends," she breathed, the world tilting on its axis. "He wasn't a warrior," Jed said softly, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "He was my brother, not by blood, but by choice, and he was complicated." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Silas, the rancher. His fury hadn't just been about pride. There was a history there, a dark, tangled connection that bound all of them together. "Silas knew him too, didn't he?" she asked, her voice flat and dead. Jed nodded slowly. They rode together, for a time. Kyle. He fell in with a bad crowd. Silas's crowd. They were outlaws, Ilara, thieves. Cale wanted out. He had met you. He wanted a different life, the one you deserved. The air grew thick with unspoken truths. "What happened to him?" she demanded, though she already knew the answer. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a cold, hard knot of dread. Silas doesn't like people leaving his circle, Jed said, his voice laced with a venomous hatred. Cale wasn't just leaving, he was going to testify. He had a ledger, proof of every robbery, every murder. He was going to give it to the marshals. But Silas found out. He didn't need to say the rest. The heroic story she had crafted for her daughters was a lie. Their father hadn't died a hero. He had been murdered by his former partner, and Silas hadn't rejected her because she had children. He had recognized her. He had seen Cale's wife, Cale's daughters, and he had seen a loose end, a threat. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. Jed was on his feet in an instant, the pistol in his hand, his body a tense coil of readiness. "They're here," he hissed, pushing her down behind a cluster of rocks. He followed us. The peaceful riverside camp was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. The whispers of the river were drowned out by the thudding of her own heart. The confrontation in town hadn't been the end. It was the prelude. Silas wasn't just a cruel man with a wounded ego. He was a killer, and he had come to finish what he started years ago. He had come to erase every last trace of the man who had dared to betray him. He had come for her, and for her children. The promise of forever now seemed like a cruel joke. The only thing waiting for them in the dark was the same violence that had stolen her husband. And this time, there might be no escape. The night exploded, not with a single shot, but with a volley of them. The rocks beside Alara's head erupted in chips of stone as bullets slammed into them. The girls woke with terrified screams, and she threw her body over them, her mind a whirlwind of pure, primal fear. Jed returned fire. His single pistol shot a sharp counterpoint to the thunder of their rifles. He was crouched low, using the fire as a distraction, a flickering, dancing target that drew their attention. "Get the girls to the river!" he yelled over the gunfire. "Follow it downstream! Don't stop!" She couldn't move. Her limbs were frozen with terror. Leaving him seemed impossible, a betrayal she couldn't stomach. But the feel of her daughter's small, trembling bodies beneath her broke the spell. She had to save them. She scrambled backward, dragging Anya and Lena with her, their whimpers lost in the chaos. The darkness was absolute, the ground uneven and treacherous. She stumbled, falling to her knees, scraping her hands on the sharp rocks. Behind her, the gunshots continued, a deadly conversation between Jed and the shadows. She reached the river's edge, the cold water shocking her senses. She pulled the girls in after her, the current tugging at their legs. "We have to be quiet," she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. They waded through the shallows, the icy water soaking their clothes, their teeth chattering with cold and fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat, every rustle of leaves a prelude to another attack. The gunshots behind them suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Was Jed. A cold fist clenched around her heart. She couldn't bear the thought. But she had to keep moving. For Anya. For Lena. They continued on, stumbling through the darkness, the river their only guide. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a flicker of light ahead. A small cabin, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Hope, desperate and foolish, flared in her chest. Maybe they could find help. Shelter. She half carried, half dragged the girls toward the light, her lungs burning, her legs aching. As she got closer, she could hear voices, a man's low grumble, and then a woman's sharp, impatient reply. She crept to the edge of the clearing, hiding behind a thicket of willows. The cabin door was open, spilling yellow lamplight onto the dirt yard, and in that light, she saw him. Silas. He wasn't dead. He wasn't even wounded. He was leaning against the doorframe, a rifle held loosely in his hands, talking to a woman inside. The woman stepped out into the light, and Alara's blood ran cold. It was the wife of the shopkeeper, the man from Redemption's End. Henderson's wife. But that wasn't what made Alara's heart stop. It was the way Silas looked at the woman, the way he reached out and casually stroked her hair, the way she leaned into his touch. They weren't strangers. They weren't even acquaintances. The whole town wasn't just scared of Silas. It was complicit. "Did you get it?" the woman asked, her voice hard. "Not yet," Silas growled. "That cowboy friend of his is tougher than he looks, but he's one man. We'll find them by morning." "You better," the woman snapped. "Henderson is getting suspicious. He almost didn't give me the extra ammunition." Henderson, the sour-faced shopkeeper who had refused her flour. He wasn't just a bigot. He was part of this. The entire town was a spiderweb, and she had walked right into the middle of it. This wasn't just about silencing a ghost from the past. There was something more, something they were all desperate to find. "Don't you worry your pretty little head," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, confident purr. "Once I get my hands on that squaw, she'll tell me where Cale hid the map, and then we'll all be rich." A map. It all came back to a map. Cale hadn't just been running from his past. He had taken something with him, something valuable enough for Silas to hunt and kill for years later. Something the whole town was willing to protect him for. Ilara's mind reeled. She had nothing. A few beaded bracelets, the clothes on her back, and her children. There was no map. Cale had never told her about a map. It was a phantom, a ghost Silas was chasing. But he believed she had it. He would never stop hunting her, because he was chasing a treasure that didn't exist. She looked at her sleeping daughters, their innocent faces illuminated by the faint light from the cabin. She was trapped, hunted for a treasure she didn't possess, by a man who had already killed her husband, in a land where every face was an enemy. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. The cowboy, Jed, was probably dead, and she and her children were utterly, completely alone. The despair was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to pull her under. She was out of options. Silas and his men would find them at first light. The whole territory was hostile. Jed was gone. It was over. But then she looked down at the small, sleeping faces of her daughters. Anya's brow was furrowed even in sleep, as if she were carrying the world's worries. Lena's mouth was slightly open, a tiny, peaceful sigh escaping her lips. They were her world. They were all that mattered. And she would not let Silas have them. She would not let this dark, greedy world swallow them whole. A new kind of fire began to burn in her veins, not the hot, quick flame of panic, but the slow, deep burn of a mother's rage. If the world was a spiderweb, she would become the fire that burned it all down. She remembered the stories her grandmother told her, not the gentle ones about talking mountains, but the hard ones, the stories of survival, of how to use the land as a weapon and a shield, of how to be a ghost when you needed to be. She carefully, silently, pulled her daughters deeper into the shadows of the willows. She whispered in their ears, waking them gently. "We're going to play a game," she breathed, her voice a low, urgent hum. "The quiet game. We have to be as quiet as the mice in the grass. Can you do that for Mama?" They nodded, their eyes wide with a fear that broke her heart, but also with a trust that strengthened her resolve. She led them away from the river, away from the treacherous open ground, and up into the rocky, wooded hills that loomed over the valley. The climb was brutal. The rocks were sharp, tearing at her worn moccasins and the soft, bare skin of the girl's feet. Every step was a risk, a chance to dislodge a stone and send it clattering down into the silence, betraying their position. But they moved with a desperate, inherited grace, their small bodies following her every move. She found a place, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of ancient, gnarled roots, barely more than a deep crack in the rock face. It was small, cramped, and smelled of damp earth, but it was hidden. She settled the girls inside, wrapping her thin blanket around them. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice imbued with an authority they had never heard before. "Do not move. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, promise me." They promised, their small faces pale in the moonlight. She left them there, a piece of her soul tearing away as she moved back into the darkness alone. She was no longer just a mother. She was a hunter. She crept back down the hillside, moving with a silence she hadn't known she possessed. She circled around the cabin, her eyes scanning the area, memorizing the placement of Silas's men. There were 3 of them, besides Silas himself. One stood guard near the horses, another was passed out by the fire with a bottle of whiskey, and the third was with Silas and the woman. She needed to even the odds. Her eyes fell on the horses, tethered loosely to a rail. An idea, wild and dangerous, sparked in her mind. If she couldn't fight them, she could strand them. She could take away their ability to chase her. With painstaking slowness, she made her way to the horses. The guard was looking toward the river, his attention focused on the direction he thought she had fled. Her heart hammered against her ribs, so loud she was sure he could hear it. She reached the tether rope and pulled out the small skinning knife she always carried. It was small, but the blade was sharp. 1 slice, 2. The ropes fell away. She gave the lead horse a hard, stinging slap on its rump. The animal whinnied in surprise and bolted, crashing through the underbrush. The rest of the herd, spooked and untethered, followed instantly. The guard spun around, cursing, raising his rifle, but it was too late. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. Silas burst out of the cabin, his face a mask of fury. "What in the hell was that?" he roared. The guard stammered, pointing dumbly into the darkness where the horses had disappeared. Silas struck him across the face, a sharp, cracking sound that echoed in the night. The commotion had bought her time, but it also meant they would be on foot, more determined, more vicious. She scrambled back toward the hills, her plan only half formed. She had made them angry, but she hadn't stopped them. And then she heard it, a low whistle from the rocks above her. It was a bird call, but not one she recognized. It came again, insistent. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Had they found her? Was it a trap? The whistle came a 3rd time, a specific pattern of notes. A pattern she had heard before. It was the tune from the simple reed whistle that Jed had carved for her daughters. He was alive. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She looked up toward the source of the sound and saw a shadow detach itself from the rocks. It was Jed. He was limping, his left arm held stiffly at his side, but he was alive. He motioned for her to come up, his movements urgent. She flew up the rocks, her exhaustion forgotten. He pulled her behind a large boulder, his good hand pressing against her mouth to keep her from crying out in relief. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice strained with pain. "I had to let them think they'd won. I circled back." He was bleeding from a wound in his side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, but his eyes were clear and hard as flint. "They'll come for us on foot now," he said, stating the obvious. "We can't outrun them, not with the girls." "So we fight," she said, her voice filled with a cold fury that surprised even herself. He looked at her, and a flicker of admiration, of surprise, showed in his eyes. "We fight," he agreed, "but not their way. Your way. This is your land, isn't it? The land of your people." She understood. He wasn't just talking about the physical terrain. He was talking about the stories, the knowledge. Silas and his men had guns and brute force, but she had the rocks, the shadows, the silence. She had the wisdom of generations who had survived in this harsh, beautiful place. "I know a place," she said, her mind racing. "A series of passages in the rocks. The old ones called it the breath of the mountain. It's a maze, easy to get lost if you don't know the way." A grim smile touched Jed's lips. "Then let's lead them into the maze." They retrieved the girls, who fell into Jed's arms with relieved sobs. Alara led them higher into the hills, the entrance to the passages a dark, narrow slit between 2 towering rock formations, almost invisible in the pre-dawn light. They slipped inside, the air immediately turning cold and damp. The chase was on, but now, the hunters were about to become the hunted, and the woman they saw as a worthless squaw, a burden, was about to become the most dangerous thing in these hills. She wasn't just fighting for a map, or for revenge. She was fighting for the future, for the two small hands that clutched hers tightly in the darkness, and for that, she would become a terror. The passages were a nightmare of twisting tunnels and sudden drop-offs. The air was thin and cold, smelling of wet stone and ancient dust. Ilara moved with a certainty that came from a place deeper than memory, from the blood that flowed in her veins. She led them through the darkness, her hand never leaving her daughter's, Jed following close behind, his breathing ragged from his wound. Behind them, they could hear the clumsy, frustrated shouts of Silas's men as they entered the maze. They were loud, crashing through the tunnels, their voices echoing off the stone walls, announcing their every move. They were hunters in a foreign land, and they were hopelessly out of their element. "They'll split up," Jed whispered, leaning against the cold wall to catch his breath. "It's what they'll do. Try to corner us." "Let them," Ilara whispered back, a cold confidence in her voice. "This mountain has teeth." She led them to a junction where 3 tunnels diverged. She stopped, listening intently to the echoes. She could hear 2 of the men coming down the left passage, Silas and the other down the center. She pointed Jed and the girls toward the right-hand tunnel. "Follow this. It will lead to an upper ledge that overlooks this cavern. Do not make a sound." Jed hesitated, his eyes filled with worry. "What are you going to do?" "My grandmother taught me how to call the wind," she said, her face grim. "Go." He nodded, understanding her unspoken meaning. He trusted her. He led the girls away, their small forms disappearing into the oppressive blackness. Ilara was alone. She waited, her heart a slow, steady drum. The sounds of the men grew closer. She picked up a loose stone, the size of her fist. When the first 2 men, Silas's thugs, entered the cavern, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, she threw the stone deep into the left-hand tunnel they had just come from. It clattered loudly in the silence. "They're over there!" one of the men yelled, and they foolishly plunged back into the tunnel, chasing an echo. Ilara didn't wait. She slipped into the center tunnel, the one Silas was in. She moved like a phantom, her feet making no sound on the sandy floor. She could smell the cheap tobacco he smoked, could hear his heavy, angry breathing. She found him peering into a side passage, his back to her. In her hand was her small skinning knife. It was a pitiful weapon against a man with a rifle, but she wasn't going to fight him face to face. She darted forward, not at him, but at the lantern he had set on the ground. She scooped it up and ran, plunging him into absolute darkness. He roared in fury, firing his rifle blindly into the tunnel. The bullet screamed past her head, and the muzzle flash illuminated the passage for a terrifying second, but she was already gone, disappearing into a crawl space she knew was there. She could hear him stumbling and cursing behind her, a blind beast in a cage of rock. She had separated him, disoriented him, now for the final piece. She made her way through the narrow passages, her body scraped and bruised, until she emerged on the ledge Jed had described. He was there, with the girls, huddled in the shadows. Below them, in the main cavern, was Silas. He had found his way there, and he had found his other 2 men, who had given up their chase of the echo. They were regrouping, their lanterns creating a small pool of defiant light in the immense darkness. "Where is she?" Silas snarled, his voice echoing unnaturally. "She's a ghost," one of the men whimpered, his nerve clearly broken. "This place ain't right." "Shut up!" Silas barked, but Ilara could see the fear in his eyes, too. He was a bully and a killer on the open prairie, but in the heart of the mountain, his power meant nothing. It was time. Jed looked at her, his eyes asking the question. She nodded. He had gathered a pile of loose rocks at the edge of the ledge. With a shared look, they began to push them over. It wasn't a landslide. Not at first. Just a few stones, clattering down into the cavern. Silas and his men looked up, their faces pale in the lantern light. Then came more stones, larger ones, a steady, relentless rain of rock. They weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to trap them. The stones crashed down around the men, blocking the passages, kicking up clouds of choking dust. One of the men panicked and tried to make a run for it, but a large boulder crashed down, blocking his path, trapping him in a dead-end tunnel. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. Silas, enraged, began firing his rifle up at the ledge. "I see you!" he roared. "I'll kill you all!" But they were hidden in the deep shadows, and his shots went wild, ricocheting off the cavern walls with terrifying shrieks. The second man threw down his gun. "I'm done!" he yelled. "I ain't dying in here!" He scrambled away, deeper into the maze, his mind clearly gone. Now it was just Silas. He stood alone in the lantern light, a cornered rat, betrayed and defeated. He stared up at the ledge, his face a twisted mask of hatred. "Cale left you nothing!" he screamed, his voice raw. "There is no map. I made it up. I told the town there was a treasure so they'd help me find you. I just wanted you dead. I wanted every trace of him gone." The confession hung in the air, echoing off the stone walls. All this death, all this fear, all this pain. For a lie. For a bitter, jealous ghost that Silas couldn't let go of. The foundation of his power, the greed that held the town in his sway, was a complete fabrication. Alara looked at Jed. His face was hard, his knuckles white as he gripped his pistol. He could end it. One shot, and it would all be over. Justice, for Cale, for her, for the years of running. But as she looked down at the pathetic, screaming man below, she felt something shift inside her. Killing him would make them the same. It would steep them in the same blood and violence that had haunted their lives for so long. She placed a hand on Jed's arm. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We leave him. We leave him to the mountain." Jed stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he lowered the gun. He understood. A quick death was a mercy. This was justice. They left Silas there, screaming his rage into the uncaring darkness, trapped in a tomb of his own making, haunted by a lie. They left him for the silence, for the cold, and for the ghosts of his own crimes. As they made their way out of the passages and into the clean, bright light of a new day, Alara knew it was finally over. The past was buried deep inside the mountain. The sun was warm on her face, and for the first time, she felt its heat not as something to be endured, but as a promise. A new beginning was waiting. They walked away from the mountain of ghosts, not looking back. The journey back toward the river was quiet, the exhaustion settling deep into their bones, but it was a good exhaustion. The kind that comes after a battle is won. The girls, though weary, seemed to sense the change. The deep, dark cloud of fear that had followed them their entire lives had finally lifted. They held hands, one with Alara, one with Jed, a perfect, unbroken circle. They reached the river's edge, the same spot where he had made his promise of forever. The water flowed clear and steady, washing the dust from the land. She watched her daughters skip stones across the surface, their laughter echoing in the peaceful air, and the sound was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. She turned to Jed, who was watching her, his face calm, the pain from his wound seemingly forgotten. She looked at the man who had walked out of the shadows and into her life, the man who had faced down her demons with her, the man who had seen her not as a burden, but as a blessing. The old words rose to her lips, the familiar, painful refrain of her life. But this time they were different. They were not a statement of fact. They were not a prophecy of doom. They were a question, a final trembling release of the fear she had held for so long. "No one," she began, her voice soft, "will accept me with my children." She looked into his eyes, ready for the answer she now knew was true, the answer he had proven with his blood and his courage. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His gaze was unbroken, steady and sure, holding all the promises of all the sunrises to come. "I'm not no one," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "And they are not a burden. They are the anchor that will hold our family steady. You three, you are my home." And then he leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't about passion or hunger, but about peace. It was a kiss that sealed a vow, a promise made not with words, but with survival, with loyalty, with love. It was the end of a long, dark road and the beginning of a new path they would walk together. The sun sank low, painting the water with fire, and as her daughters ran to them, wrapping their small arms around their legs, she knew she had finally found the one thing she had stopped believing in: a place to belong, a family, a forever. If you believe that everyone deserves a chance at happiness and a place to call home, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the darkest of nights, a new day is always waiting to dawn.